Welcome, Assalamu alaikum, YouTube. We are back again with another session with our brother Jamie Turner. This, let me remind you, is a course in religious epistemology and Islamic theism. After having gone through the nuts and bolts of epistemology and the basics of the various schools of Islamic religious epistemology, we are now going to take a deep dive, inshallah, into the first of the classical Islamic schools today. Let me reintroduce our brother Jamie Turner, who's a little sleepy today, but inshallah, it's going to get better over the next hour or so, I hope. Jamie Turner is a doctoral scholar in the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Birmingham, and he has published many papers in this field. So over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Danish. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Yes, let me just make my screen a bit bigger. Yeah. So as you said, Danish, helpfully, in the previous sessions, we tried to basically look at what we mean by epistemology in general, and religious epistemology in particular. That was really the key aim. And the very last session we did before this one, we sort of gave a brief overview of the different trends and positions within Islamic religious epistemology. And so in this session and the forthcoming sessions, we want to look at those particular trends in more detail and more depth. So today we have Islamic Rationalism. In the next sessions, we'll look at traditionalism and mysticism. So yeah, that's basically it. So let us get started. So the overview for today's session, as usual, is split into three parts or components. One is the basic epistemology of rationalism, then rationalist religious epistemology, and then we will consider three potential problems or challenges for rationalists, and we can reflect on how they might overcome those challenges. But we want to consider ways in which rationalists might be challenged in some sense by the other trends or traditions within Islamic religious epistemology. However, before we dive into those three components, we should say something about what we mean by Islamic rationalism in the first place. So this will do for a basic definition of what I'm referring to when I'm talking about Islamic rationalism. So to begin with, Islamic rationalism might be defined as that segment of the Islamic tradition which laid the greatest emphasis on reason, or aql, in religious epistemology, i.e. that religious belief in God and belief in the prophet as being a true prophet, must be based on rational arguments in some sense. So notice that this definition says that Islamic rationalism is the segment of the tradition which laid perhaps the greatest emphasis on reason in some sense, which is not to say that the other trends had no emphasis or laid no emphasis at all on reason. And as we'll see perhaps in the next session, even Islamic traditionalists would probably be unhappy with this characterization because they perhaps have a different conception of reason. But in my view, this would be a fair characterization, just taking a step back from those trends. So this trend or segment of the Islamic tradition within religious epistemology is roughly the kalam approach, or it basically comes down to the schools of ilm al-kalam. So in the Sunni tradition, obviously, we have the Ash'ari and the Maturidi schools of kalam. But before those two Sunni schools, obviously the Mu'tazila school basically got the process going in some sense. So we can include that as a school of ilm al-kalam, particularly because the Ash'ari and Maturidi schools actually do basically draw on the same sort of epistemic tools as the Mu'tazilas did. It's just that they came to very different conclusions in the end, perhaps we might put it that way. So that's what I mean by Islamic rationalism. Basically, kalam, the religious epistemology of the mutakallimun. Okay, so part one. What is the basic epistemology of rationalism? This is what we want to think about to begin with in part one, because the general epistemology of Muslim or Islamic rationalists is going to shape the religious epistemology that they take. So what happens here in terms of their general epistemology basically forms the bedrock of what happens when we turn our attention to matters concerning belief in God and Islam. And that's not just for rationalists. That also applies, generally speaking, for the other elements within the tradition too. Okay. So now you should be perhaps familiar with this. This particular slide, I'm not going to spend any time on this. This is a slide we already covered in the previous session, but I just want to put it out there to begin with, that this classification of there being two forms of knowledge, one divine or eternal knowledge, and two human temporal knowledge, is a classification that the mutakallimun in particular brought forward. This is really their classification. If anybody deserves a right to own this classification, it would be them. Now, we touched a little bit on this distinction between non-inferential and inferential knowledge as an introduction in the last session, but I really want to focus on it in more depth in this session, because with respect to the epistemology of the rationalists, this idea or this difference or distinction between what's daruri and what's nadari with respect to our knowledge, that really forms the centerpiece of their epistemology going forward, and will have such significant ramifications for their religious epistemology as well. So that's what we should be turning our attention toward. However, as another final preface or qualification before we do that, you might also be familiar with this slide. We have looked at this slide before on a couple of occasions, although it's slightly different at the moment because, interestingly, these two components of it have gone missing, and I'll mention that in a second. But generally speaking, the sources of knowledge that we have talked about, say, in the previous session, are upheld by the Islamic rationalists. They believe that we can acquire knowledge about the world through reason, through our sense perceptual faculties, through introspection, through testimony and memory. Now, if you may recall, here, this element of the sources of knowledge was intuition or al-hads, and then this element was fitra. And the mutakallimun didn't really lay much emphasis at all on those two cognitive abilities as sources of knowledge. So the focus is predominantly on these five, and so that's why I've left them out. Okay, but now let's go into looking at this distinction for the mutakallimun then between the inferential and non-inferential knowledge. So now this classification, so here the title of the slide is The Nature of Non-Inferential Knowledge, or ilm daruri, for the Islamic rationalists. Now this classification is taken from an article written by Binyamin Abrahamov, and he looks at necessary knowledge, or ilm daruri, in the Islamic tradition. And basically Abrahamov compiles various different statements, quotations and analyses of texts of the Kalam scholars concerning ilm daruri, and he basically tries to come up with a kind of criteria on the basis of looking at those various different quotations and so on of what the Kalam folk are saying non-inferential knowledge is, and he comes up with these five. So let's start thinking about these five. So what is non-inferential knowledge? What is ilm daruri? Well, number one, apparently, non-inferential knowledge occurs in a person without their power or control. Okay, so it's not something of our own making. It's not really on the basis of our inspection or inquiry, where we have power and control in the process of inquiry, but it's something that occurs without our power and control. So, to give an example, when I look at this phone in my hand, it's beyond my power and control to not believe that that phone is there. I can't help it. If you ask me to just look in certain places in this room, I just form beliefs about things in my environment. I cannot help doing that. If you make a loud sound, if Danny shouts out now, I will hear it. I will form a belief about what Danny said. I can't help that. That's beyond my power and control. But there are other beliefs, and we'll get to that when we look at inferential knowledge, that are more readily within our power and control to form. Okay, so that's number one. Two, it is in some sense necessary. Okay, it's in some sense necessary. Like basically what that means is that the knowledge that we have that's daruri, that's necessary, is something that's like necessary to our very nature. Just given who we are, given our makeup, we can't help having this kind of knowledge. Given our makeup, it's necessary that when I, hold the phone in front of me, I form the belief that it is in front of me. Okay, so that's number two. Number three, non-inferential knowledge is produced directly by God. This is the impression that you get from the Mutakallimun, that unlike inferential knowledge, which relates to what we do and concerns our power and action, this particular knowledge is just produced directly within us by God. Now, we don't need to think about it in terms of, say, when we have this knowledge, that's God at every moment, like zapping us and inducing us with that particular knowledge. That you could think about it like that if you want to, but it's probably more proper to think of it in terms of, again, God creating us with a certain nature and capacity which immediately grasps certain things without our activity, really, without our willing and action. Of course, just as a side note, the Mutakallimun were occasionalists, right? So anything that basically happens in the world is actually directly caused by God in some sense anyway, because they don't believe in natural causation in the world. So it's interesting how one can make the distinction between direct and indirect. But anyway, that's just a side note. So that's three. Number four, the knowledge is indubitable. That just means it cannot be doubted. It cannot be reasonably doubted. So the knowledge that we have, which is daruri, we can't reasonably or rationally doubt that. I can't. You see, it's not rational for me to doubt that there is this phone in front of me. It's you can't doubt that. It's just so overwhelmingly, profoundly obvious that it's indubitable. It cannot be doubted. And five, it is absent from any form of speculation, which is kind of just related to four. But this knowledge is not acquired by us speculating and pondering and thinking and wondering. It happens immediately, by necessity, and indubitably. Okay, so that's how the Mutakallimun, the Kalam folk, understand non-inferential knowledge, just in terms of its nature, what it actually is. So what are some types of non-inferential knowledge? Well, the thing is, the scholars of Kalam basically restricted non-inferential knowledge to just 3 kinds of things, actually. And they are as follows. So the first is self-evident beliefs, okay? And these are what are sometimes referred to as al-badihiyat. These are self-evident beliefs. And an example is that 1 + 1 = 2. Why is that a self-evident belief? Because as soon as you understand the terms in the proposition, as soon as you grasp the meaning of 1 + 1 = 2, you immediately see that it is true. As soon as you understand it, you see that it is true, right? It's not like a proposition, it is raining outside. As soon as I understand the terms of that proposition, it doesn't follow that it is raining. It doesn't follow that it is true. But as soon as I understand the terms in this proposition, it is immediately obvious that it is true, right? So that would, in the Kalam view, meet the 5 criteria that we have just looked at. Secondly, they also think that sense perceptual beliefs are forms of non-inferential knowledge as well. If we recall here, we had this distinction between sense perception and introspection. But if you look at the Arabic, they are both forms of al-hiss, right? They are just basically forms of hiss. One is al-batin, one is internal, and one is al-zahir, one is external. In English, it would be proper to render al-hiss al-batin as an introspection. But essentially, for the Kalam scholars, it's a form of sense perception. So that I feel happy, sad, or pain, that is an internal state, okay, that I immediately grasp, right? That, I can't be mistaken about it, okay? When I just have it immediately to me. It's beyond my power, my control to not feel, to not have that thought. And likewise, with respect to things in my external environment, it's beyond my power, my control to doubt that I see a cup, a chair, a person, or whatever it might be in our external environment. Just one small thing to say on this element of external perception. So in Western philosophy, in the Enlightenment period, with thinkers like René Descartes and John Locke, they made a slight qualification of these kinds of beliefs. So when I like hold this flask in front of me, I see it. I immediately see it. And people like Descartes and Locke, they would say that my seeing this flask in front of me, the fact that I have the experience of seeing it, that cannot be doubted, because that's something inside my head, right? I have the experience inside my mind. But the fact that there is actually a flask outside in the world, that can be doubted. I can't doubt the experience of seeing it, but I can doubt that there is actually such a thing as a flask in the world. But the Kalam scholars and the medieval theologians, philosophers, they didn't make that distinction. So they were taking external sense perception as being a source of non-inferential knowledge, in the sense that I see a cup or the flask, and that belief with respect to the thing in the world can be known non-inferentially. Okay, the third thing, testimonial beliefs. Okay, beliefs that are based on khabar or report. Now, not all testimonial beliefs are forms of non-inferential knowledge. So although it says testimonial beliefs, it's not that all testimonial beliefs are going to meet the criteria of non-inferential knowledge, but that only special kinds of testimony can, and that would be testimony that is mutawatir, basically, that is massively transmitted. That cannot be reasonably doubted. So that China exists, even if we haven't been to China, there's such a mass testimony with respect to the existence of a country in the world that's China, that would be known just daruri, that the earth is spherical and not flat, for any flat earthers out there. That testimony is widely, massively transmitted and reported. The same with that Germany lost World War II. Now, that's very different from Danish telling me that he had, cereal for breakfast. That's not of the same kind. And maybe I would have to make the inference that that's true on the basis of Danish's character and what I know about him. So that would be different. But the forms of testimony that is mutawatir, that would be a form of ilm daruri for the mutakalimun. And yes, Danish, over to you.
Yes. All right. So the Buddhists, some of the Buddhists in Tibet, they used to believe that they had a certain cosmology, that the earth was, let's say, flat, or there was a plateau, and then, basically just universalize this and say that certain cosmologies are understood or believed by everybody. So would that mean that that is also a kind of testimonial belief, because that's the testimony that is prevalent in society in some sense?
So I couldn't.
How would that become non-inferential knowledge?
I couldn't hear the last part of your question because the connection sort of broke up. So I got to that there are certain Buddhists in Tibet, and they had a certain cosmology concerning the earth being flat. That's all I heard so far.
Okay, so let's just say that I'm actually not very clear on what the Buddhists actually believed, but it seems like they do believe that there is. Yeah, all right. Let's just say any belief, X, Y, Z. Would that be a testimony? Because that is the testimony that they get from their scholars. And so would that be zaruri in some sense under this understanding?
So no, testimony or khabar is not per se daruri for the Kalam scholars, but only testimony that is mutawatir, that would be daruri. So, like I said, if you told me that, you had whatever you had for breakfast, that's just you as a single reporter telling me something. That wouldn't be mutawatir. For people in their religious communities, okay, they obviously will be told by their religious clerics and so on certain things, and that will be testimonial when they are acquiring that knowledge on the basis of their priests or clerics or clergymen telling them things. But it wouldn't that wouldn't meet the standard of mutawatir, I would say, for the mutakalimun, just because a particular isolated group have a certain conception or notion as to what the earth is like. That's very different from a very, very broad and widespread conception to say as to what the earth consists of. So that's what I would think anyway.
All right. So let me empty it out of its religious context and expert testimonial context. So pre-American age, would it be ilm daruri that the earth is the center of the universe?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. I think that this raises a problem for the classification of ilm daruri for the mutakalimun. So that the reason why I would say is because, you see, I think in the first session, we talked about different epistemic things like knowledge, and also like rationality and justification. So I think people that were living at a certain time in history, it would be justifiable for them to believe that the Earth was the center of the universe. They were wrong, but the evidence that they had available to them at that time suggested that it was. So that, you know, they were reasonable, they were being rational, they were justified, but they were wrong. I guess the trouble for this notion here is that ilm daruri, we're talking about knowledge which in some sense cannot be doubted, that's certain, that's indubitable or infallible. So, you know, at the time in history when many people thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, it looks like it meets the third kind of belief there, testimonial beliefs, that is massively reported. And yet it would be strange for us to call that ilm daruri, because ilm daruri has to be on something that's certain and certainly true, and yet it turns out that this was false. So I guess, and that for me, that's not a problem, because I'm a fallibilist. I think knowledge doesn't have to meet the bar of certainty, and I think the Mutakallimun would say that too. But it's very difficult to see how just because something is really, really massively reported by people, it is necessarily certain. I guess though what the Mutakallimun could just say is that, well, ilm daruri just is knowledge which cannot be rationally doubted at whatever time we exist. So actually, at the time of the people, at that time when people thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, actually that would be ilm daruri for them. But it wouldn't be ilm daruri anymore, because we have a defeater that takes our knowledge away. So
Right, excellent.
I would say that ilm daruri is something that cannot be rationally doubted. But then if at some point there is something that gives us reason to rationally doubt it, it would lose its status. So maybe ilm daruri is not is a status that can actually change, maybe.
Right, all right. Thank you so much.
That's okay. Okay, so that was non-inferential knowledge. This is inferential knowledge. So, ilm nadari as opposed to daruri. Well, in this case, it occurs in a person by their power and control. If non-inferential knowledge occurs without a person's power and control, then inferential knowledge must occur in a person by their own power and control. Okay, so if we imagine somebody who is, say, a detective or a judge or a scientist or a historian who's trying to figure out answers to certain questions, scientific questions. How old is the universe? Did the universe have a beginning? What was civilization like in ancient Greece? Who committed the crime? Was it John or Bob or Bill or Steve that stole the money? The judge in court has to make a decision as to the relative guilt or innocence of someone who's being brought forward. The knowledge that might occur in these contexts occurs only by a person's control and power and engagement in the discipline. So it is, as number 2 says, acquired in some sense. It's actually acquired by us. Scientists who figure out that electrons exist on the basis of observations and experiments, they have to carry out those observations and experiments and go through that process of inquiry until that knowledge is acquired by them. So therefore, it's produced not directly by God, but indirectly, we might say. It's everything that we have is created and sustained by God, but God gives us some form of freedom to act and agency. And so whatever knowledge we acquire through our agency, that is produced only then indirectly by God, and we have some direct ownership over it too. And ilm nadari ranges from probable to certain. So There could be forms of knowledge which we have to figure out ourselves, okay, that we acquire in some way, but nonetheless, it can still be really, really, really certain, or it could be not so certain and it could be probable. So consider, for instance, scientists who have told us from the time of Isaac Newton onwards about the force of gravity and the fact that there is this force in our physical universe. That the evidence that we have for the force of gravity is overwhelmingly profound, such that we are certain that there is such a thing as gravity. But it's not daruri, it's still on the basis of nadar, of rational inquiry, but it's certain. But whether, for instance, it was John or Bob or Bill that committed a crime, maybe our evidence in determining who was actually the criminal is, underdetermined. We don't have sufficient evidence. So we can make a probabilistic judgment as to who's most likely the one who committed the crime, but it's not certain. Okay? The reason why I'm stressing that and emphasizing the probability and certainty thing is because, I'm not going to give it away, actually. Okay, but you might have already been able to figure out. All right, so types of non-inferential knowledge. So I've sort of hinted at them already. Now, the historical belief one, by the way, probably needs to change. But anyway, so scientific beliefs that the universe had a beginning 13.7 billion years ago. This is not daruri. This is something that scientists need to figure out, okay, on the basis of scientific inquiry. And it has relative probability, not necessarily certainty. There are other models of the universe and the cosmic beginning of the universe. Historical beliefs that Plato wrote the Republic. From a historian's point of view, the historian wants to try and figure out whether Plato existed, whether Plato was real, and whether it can't be non-inferential, it is inferred. What was the question related to, Razabai? Can you clarify? And I'll get back to that in a second. The heading, types of, oh, yes, you're right. It should say types of inferential knowledge. Thanks. That was my fault. I should clarify. This should say types of inferential knowledge, al-nadari, not types of non-inferential knowledge. Thank you. My mistake. So historians that are figuring out whether Plato existed and he actually wrote this text called the Republic, they have to go through a process of inquiry to try and figure out, on the basis of various pieces of evidence, whether Plato actually existed and whether we can actually attribute this to him, right? So that's nadari. And criminological beliefs, like, again, related to crime, that John committed the crime, the detective has to determine on the basis of fingerprints, motives and intentions, maybe camera footage, relative proximity to the crime scene, as to whether John was the one who committed the crime. Okay, so those would be three types of non-inferential knowledge. They're not exhaustive. So notice that this actually was an exhaustive list of non-inferential knowledge of al-daruri. Here, this is not an exhaustive list. Okay, so any knowledge which is not daruri, which requires our own effort and inquiry, which ranges from probable to certain, that can fall into this category. All right. Now, the upshot of all of this basically culminates in this picture of epistemology, this overarching perspective and picture on the nature of knowledge and rationality, maybe. And this is called classical foundationalism. So this distinction between inferential and non-inferential knowledge, and specifically in the way that the Kalam people have done it, amounts to this thesis, right? All of our discussion so far has gotten us to this central view: classical foundationalism. Now, in the first session, we did mention foundationalism. Okay, so foundationalism is basically the view that some of our knowledge is non-inferential, that there are certain things we know without an argument. We don't need an argument to know it, like the things that we see in front of us and so on. And on the basis of these foundational beliefs, we build other forms of knowledge. So a scientist who comes to the belief that the universe began to exist 13.7 billion years ago, they have to have a starting point. What is the foundation of their view? Well, their foundation is going to be their basic observations. That they don't need an argument for their observations or a theory about their observations. The observations are basic. Then on the basis of their observations and experiments, they build and they can culminate in some kind of theory. So that's foundationalism in general, that some of our knowledge is daruri. We have ilm daruri. Ilm daruri is a real thing. If you believe in ilm daruri, you're a foundationalist. You believe in foundationalism. But there are different kinds of foundationalism. And this is where the Kalam guys come in and they put a classical spin on the foundationalism. Classical foundationalists believe that the foundations of our knowledge are certain. They are indubitable. They cannot be doubted. They're infallible. They cannot be wrong in some sense, right? And generally speaking, classical foundationalists uphold two types of beliefs which they think are the basis of our foundations. One, self-evident logical truths like 1 + 1 = 2, or that the whole of something is greater than the part of something. As soon as you understand the terms, you know and see that the proposition is true. And perceptual beliefs, that I feel pain, happy, sad, or that I experience a cup, a flask, whatever it may be. I cannot doubt those things, okay? So they are certain or indubitable. Now, in the Western tradition, they never, ever mentioned testimonial beliefs, mutawatir type testimony. They never mentioned that. But the Muslim Kalam people, medieval Muslims did. That's the additional thing we might add to classical foundationalism that Muslims added, that there's a form of testimony which is so massively transmitted that it becomes indubitable. It becomes unreasonable or irrational to doubt it. So it meets our foundations. It joins the foundations. Okay. So that's the overarching picture of epistemology, really, though, for Islamic rationalists. And you might already have taken note of the fact that, belief in God is not mentioned as being foundationalism and that as being foundational, and that's going to be key. So classical foundationalism forms the overarching epistemology. Okay. Part 2, rationalist religious epistemology. So we begin, first and foremost, in terms of thinking about faith, religious faith. Now, we did mention this briefly in the last session, that there are different understandings of religious belief or religious faith. Okay. Now, Islamic rationalists basically thought that faith or iman just amounts to tasdiq, essentially. It just amounts to affirmation or assent. And so, therefore, faith, or say faith in God and God's existence, is ultimately believing the proposition that God exists. That is faith for them. Faith and belief are essentially synonymous. So faith is fundamentally a matter of belief. So it should say, if it is treated as a belief, oh no, sorry, there's no mistake. So it is treated as a belief which falls into either the category of being inferential or non-inferential. If religious faith is belief, and beliefs and knowledge are either nadari or daruri, faith has to be in one of those camps. That's the only way it can go. So belief in God for Islamic rationalists has to either be inferential or non-inferential. And finally, it is a special kind of belief. It's not a belief like, the beliefs we have about things in our external environment. It is a belief concerning the realm of the unseen, right? It's a belief that concerns an entity which exists outside of the physical universe, outside of space and time, as the Kalam people would see it. Okay, so the fundamental starting point for their religious epistemology then is that faith is belief. So, is it inferential? Is it non-inferential? Well, it's clear that faith as belief was recognized as inferential for the Kalam scholars, not non-inferential. So, this can be summarized in a nice passage here from Nicholas Heers, so I'll read this. Knowledge of all these matters pertaining to God's existence can be gained only through reasoning, nadar. This is because such knowledge is not necessary, daruri, but is on the contrary acquired or muktasab or nadari. Nor can it be gained through illumination, ilham, or through purification of the inner self, tasfiyatul batin, or by instruction, ta'lim of an infallible imam. So, this basically summarizes the Kalam perspective, that belief in God does not meet the category of daruri. It doesn't fall into the category because the 5 criteria that we mentioned earlier, they don't apply to belief in God. That's what they thought. And we're going to reflect on whether that's correct or not in the third part. But ultimately, they believe that belief in God isn't like logical self-evident truths, 1 + 1 = 2. Belief in God isn't like me seeing a flask. Belief in God isn't simply a matter of belief on the basis of testimony, but it is something different. It is a inferential belief. Now, there are 3 key intuitions as to why it should be considered non-inferential. The first of these 3 intuitions is interesting because it sort of is a little bit different from what we've been thinking about so far in terms of the distinction between non-inferential and inferential. But this intuition is that belief in God, because it's not like, beliefs that are logically self-evident or beliefs about things in our external environment and so on, it can't just be based on us following what our community say or following our socio-environment. It has to be based on some kind of process of inquiry or inferential inquiry, because the opposite of not inquiring for the Kalam scholars is taqlid, just blind following. So you have this dichotomy of inferential and inferential. You have another dichotomy of either inquiring or just simply blind following. And they would say, well, clearly blind following is not a reliable way to acquire truth about religious matters. Consider the fact that there are so many different religious traditions that have mutually incompatible beliefs about God, or in fact beliefs concerning the non-existence of God. So taqlid can't be the way forward. we need to inquire. Secondly, as I've already mentioned, belief in God is not like our ordinary perceptual beliefs. Ordinary perceptual beliefs work in a way that, as soon as I see this phone in front of me, like I form the belief. I can't help it. I just can't help it. And it can't be rationally doubted in that way. And it's so overwhelmingly obvious. But there's something about belief in God, which they're not saying it can't be, they're not saying it can be rationally doubted, but it doesn't have the overwhelming immediate obviousness when you compare it to belief in me seeing this phone. It might have an obviousness after you inquire, right? Once you go through the process of inquiry, it has an obviousness and a certainness, like it's certain, but it's not overwhelmingly immediately obvious before the inquiry. And the third intuition is about the duty that we have then to inquire. Because if we can't rely on taqlid and we have a duty to know God, then the only way that we can fulfill that duty is to go through the process of inquiry. And so this is called wujub al-nadar, the duty to use discursive reasoning to acquire knowledge of God. So these are three central intuitions that come out of the basic epistemology of rationalists and that form the bedrock of their religious epistemology. And of course, these are connected to the overall classical foundationalist picture. So acquiring knowledge of God then for the mutakallimun must be through the process of nadari proofs. It must be through a process of rational inquiry, of basically arguing for the existence of God. It's a process of inference based on evidence, construed in terms of argument. So the Muslim rationalists were evidentialists. They believe that belief in God has to be based on evidence, and that evidence consists in having a good argument. Now, in particular, this argument, because it concerns a belief in an entity that exists in an unseen realm, this argument or inference basically moves from the observable world to what is unseen. It's an istidlal bishahid al-ghaib. It's an inference from what is witnessed and seen, the universe, to what is not seen, God. So there are various different arguments that the Kalam scholars came up with. But there is a very central argument to the Kalam perspective. And this, in contemporary philosophy of religion, even gets its title from the medieval tradition of Kalam, and it's called the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, there are different ways in which the Mutakallimun spelt this out. But here's a simple way of thinking about it, and this is how it's spelt out in contemporary philosophy, but also how you find it in the works of the Kalam scholars as well. Al-Ghazali, for example, in one of his books, Iqtisad fil i'tiqad, moderation in belief, for instance, you can find literally this formatting of the argument there. So the argument says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. So the universe has a cause, i.e. God. And of course, there would be further reflection as to why the cause must be God. But the Kalam scholars wanted to say that things can't come from nothing. Things that have a beginning must have had a prior cause. They can't have just popped into being without from nothing. So that gets you first to the first premise. The second premise, they would argue that an infinite regress of temporal events is impossible. And one of the simple arguments you find would be something like the following. Suppose there is an infinite succession of moments before the present moment. Because if the universe was eternal, it would be infinite in the past. The time of the universe, temporally speaking, it would have an infinite past. But if you had to traverse an infinite set of moments to get to the present moment, you would never arise at the present moment. But we are at the present moment, so there can't be an infinite succession of past events. So therefore, the universe must have a beginning. And if the universe has a beginning, and whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe must have a cause. And when you reflect on the universe as consisting of all time and space and matter and energy, the cause must be outside of the universe itself. So God, the cause, must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and have properties like power and will and knowledge to be able to construct the universe with the creatures that we see, and so on and so forth. And that gets us to God. And of course, this is not the only argument, but it's one of the arguments. And the Mutakallimun would say that on the basis of these arguments, we can have certain knowledge that God exists. It's not that we have any rational doubt. Just because it's not daruri doesn't mean that it's not certain, but it's still nadari. So basically, they're saying knowledge of God has to be based on evidence. Evidence is construed in terms of having a rational argument, and that rational argument is an istidlal bishahid al-ghaib, okay? An inference from the observable world to the unseen, okay? But having said that, there are different ways of thinking about how we could acquire knowledge of God, even if arguments need to be at the forefront of the acquisition. And there are three different ways of thinking about how knowledge of God can be acquired on the basis of rational argument. So we have three views that we find amongst the Kalam scholars, and they're all versions of theistic evidentialism. What I mean by that is simply, as I said in the previous slide, that theism, belief in God, to be knowledge has to be based on evidence, okay? And the evidence is in terms of generally an argument. So we have strong versions of this, moderate versions of this, and I probably should have just put weak, but sensible evidentialism, I've put it there because it is actually a specific view in the literature. But we should probably just said strong, moderate, weak, maybe. That would have been perhaps easier. But so strong theistic evidentialism that we see amongst Kalam scholars like Qadi Abdul Jabbar al-Maturidi al-Jawaini. So we have a Mu'tazili, Maturidi, Ash'ari representatives of this. They basically say that for one's belief in God or Iman to be a knowledge, you have to yourself base it on a kind of rational argument. And that rational argument might be something like this argument we've just seen, right? Whatever begins to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. That could be an example of that. But this view implies that we ourselves have to have access to this argument through actually inferring, going through this inferential process ourselves. A more moderate version of theistic evidentialism would be to say that actually we needn't necessarily know the ins and outs of a proof with its premises and its conclusion, but that in some sense we form our belief in God on the basis of reflections that come very close to this argument or proof, but because we simply don't have the conceptual tools to kind of fill it out, because we're not philosophers or theologians, we can still know, but it should still be based on some kind of reflection. So like if you were to ask an ordinary person why they believe in God, they might say to you, well, just look around you, just look at the world, look at how it's all really well designed and really well put together. And a non-philosopher can say that. An ordinary person can say that. And it seems like the way that they're thinking is, it's almost like they're thinking in terms of a design argument for the existence of God, right? They're actually kind of making the argument, but they haven't got the time and the conceptual tools to actually flesh it out. But they're kind of doing it, right? So maybe that's sufficient for ordinary people, that they do reflect, they do inquire, they do another within their ability, and maybe they can know God in that fashion. We find Sanusi, he seems to present something similar to that. Now, I did say there it may be based on seemings of religious experience, but I didn't mention it because I've actually changed my opinion on this slightly. Okay, sensible theistic evidentialism. This is the view that rational arguments are really central to acquiring knowledge of God, but that the argument just needs to be in the community somewhere. So just as scientists conduct experiments and can tell us things about, electrons and the expansion of the universe and the force of gravity, and those beliefs that scientists have must be based on scientific observation and experimentation. Nonetheless, we as non-scientists can be rational and even acquire knowledge just on the basis of trusting their testimony. But the only way that we would acquire knowledge, of course, is if those experiments and observations really are accurate. So it does, in some sense, depend on those observations and experiments being accurate and being true. But we ourselves don't need to do them. Maybe this is the same for belief in God. Maybe the theologians and scholars have the arguments, and maybe we can trust them and we can believe on the basis of their telling us so after their, philosophical inquiry. So these are three different views or different conceptions we find within Islamic rationalism concerning how knowledge of God is acquired through rational argument. Okay. The final thing before we end is just to reflect on three potential issues for the rationalist. So, problem one. Problem one concerns their epistemology in general. Problem 2 and 3 concerns their religious epistemology in particular. Okay? So there are two ways we could raise problems. We could attack their epistemology in general, or we could attack their religious epistemology. So problem one is the problem of skepticism concerning classical foundationalism. Okay, let me take you a little bit back for a moment. This was classical foundationalism, and we said that classical foundationalism basically followed from the Kalam conception of knowledge as dururi and nadari. Yeah, it just followed from that. Now, classical foundationalism says that the foundations of our knowledge, those beliefs that we can believe without having an argument, they have to be certain. Okay. The worry about this is that there are many beliefs that we hold not on the basis of argument and that are not, infallible in the way that classical foundationalists want the foundations to be. Okay, so consider my belief in other persons, by which I mean the belief that other people have conscious minds like my own, right? Notice that we can't actually, open up somebody's skull and open their brain and find their mind and their feelings and thoughts and desires. So I have this belief that there are other persons, and I believe that immediately. As soon as I meet Danish, I don't, make an inference. He seems not all that robotic. He doesn't seem to have typical AI traits. I think he could be a human. We don't go through that process of inference. We just believe in an immediate way that our fellow human beings are mind-like creatures, just like ourselves. So it seems to be like a foundational belief. Okay, but they said that it can't get into the foundations. It can't. There are only two foundations: logical, self-evident truths, and basic perceptual truths of our perceptions of our feeling states or of what we observe. Okay, so it can't be among our foundations. So can we make a good argument for it? Well, probably not, but we also don't hold it on the basis of an argument anyway. So that would mean we can't know that there are other people. Well, what about the belief in the external world as being real? We believe that in an immediate way, but it also doesn't meet their foundation, so we can't know that. What about belief in the fact that our memories correspond to events that actually happened in the past? We don't hold that belief on the basis of an argument, but again, it doesn't meet their foundation, so it wouldn't be a piece of knowledge. So the problem with classical foundationalism in philosophy has been this problem of skepticism. It seems to just rule out a lot of our knowledge. So if it's implausible in that way, we should just throw it out and have a different model. And if we throw it out, then none of the things that follow about religious epistemology, none of those things obviously follow anymore. So that's one problem that the Kalam people have to maybe contend with. The second problem is, let's just grant, for the sake of argument, everything that the Kalam folks say about knowledge and epistemology. Let's just grant it. Wouldn't belief in God just meet their criteria for al-Daruri anyway? Wouldn't belief in God just be non-inferential? So remember that the Kalam scholars basically came up with 5 different elements that composed their definition of al-Daruri. 1, that the belief occurs in a person beyond their control, that it's necessary in some sense, produced by God directly, it's indubitable, and absent from speculation. So suppose somebody has, and this does happen, an overwhelming experience and sense of God's presence before them. That seems to occur to a person beyond their control. They can't just will into existence a religious experience. It seems to be necessary. It seems to just be something that happens to them immediately, but it's also part of the human makeup in some sense to be able to have those experiences. It then would be produced by God directly. And I mean, aren't all things on the Kalam view produced by God directly anyway? Perhaps the person just can't doubt it. It's so overwhelmingly profound, just as seeing this is overwhelmingly profound, that they can't doubt it. And it's not based on speculation. So belief in God seems to be able to meet these 5 criteria. And so belief in God can be al-Daruri. So that's a problem. And the final problem is their construal of what Iman or faith actually amounts to. Belief in God or faith or Iman is not merely assent to some proposition or an acknowledgement of the conclusion of an argument in an abstract way, but it includes a spiritual component. It includes like the love of God, awe and reverence and praise of God, gratitude towards God. It involves a trusting commitment that you put your trust or tawakkul in God, and that you take practical action before him in worshipping him, in praising him, in supplicating to him. Faith is just a lot more than what they seem to be reducing it to. It's like a reductionist account of faith. And another thing that happens when you understand faith just in terms of intellectual assent, how do you actually explain away intelligent atheists? Now, you could just say there are no intelligent atheists, right? You could just say, when, I don't mean in general, but I mean with respect to the God question, that any philosopher who thinks about the God question and the arguments for the existence of God, and they come up with a different opinion, they're dumb. They're not intelligent. Okay. But there's a really interesting comparison. On the one hand, say Richard Swinburne. Richard Swinburne is a Christian philosopher, and he has a book called The Existence of God. And he basically tries to argue that God exists on the basis of Bayesian probability calculus. Okay. And on the other hand, you have J.L. Mackie, who is his atheist interlocutor, and he wrote a book called The Miracle of Theism. And he argues on the basis of Bayesian probability calculus that God doesn't exist, right? So they use the same method. They're both very intelligent philosophers. One's a theist, one's an atheist. Now, are we just going to say that Mackie's judgment is because he is somehow less intelligent and is less philosophically minded? Or is he missing something else? Perhaps he's missing the kind of spiritual or theistic disposition and desire for God that is required to acquire evidence for him. Perhaps there's something extra that's needed, and it's not simply brute intelligence or something like that. Okay. So in summary, the Islamic Rationalists, their general epistemology is classical foundationalism. Their religious epistemology is theistic evidentialism, that knowledge of God is acquired through rational evidence. And there are three basic problems that they might have to contend with. Scepticism in general, that belief in God seems to meet their criteria of being non-inferential or daruri, and that belief in God is actually more than just intellectual assent. Okay, I'm done. Thanks very much.
So, okay, I'll begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back. So, Brother Jamie, based on what we discussed today, there are a few questions which come to my mind immediately. So I'm going to address them first and bring them in front of you. So one of the things that you did speak about was one of the characterizations of ilm al-daruri, I think, was that it is knowledge which is, in a sense, without our power. It is something that that God put in us, if I'm not wrong. That to me sounds a lot like something like instinct. So instinct would perhaps be a better word for that rather than knowledge. So what would you say to that? And then I'll come back.
So instinct might be the basis upon which we arrive at those beliefs, if you want to put it like that. So it sounds like to me that what you're describing is you're using instinct as like the source, but maybe instincts can be a source of knowledge, you know what I'm saying? So that doesn't matter too much. So for instance, perhaps it's an instinctual belief to believe that, rape is wrong. Just that's instinctive, or that incest is wrong. You have that kind of instinct. Okay, but maybe that can be a source of knowledge. For the Mutakallimun, it would be a source of knowledge if the belief meets whatever the criteria of knowledge is. Obviously, al-daruri is knowledge, would be a belief that's indubitable, that can't be reasonably doubted. So if you have an instinctual belief that it can't be rationally doubted, then that would be true. It would be a piece of knowledge, and it would be daruri.
What I was thinking was more in line with basic mathematical truths.
Yes.
So a belief like 2 + 2 = 4. I don't think of anybody I've ever met, even somebody with sub-normal intelligence, who says that 2 + 2 = 5. So this is something that is instinctive, in that I don't know of anybody who believes otherwise. A belief like rape is wrong is still inferential. You have to have an understanding of what rape means, and you have to have an understanding of what wrong means, and then you infer. And then at least a couple of steps of reasoning go on in order to reach that belief. So what would you say about mathematical beliefs?
I would, first of all, I would just disagree with what you just said. you don't arrive at the belief that rape is wrong by, in the sense of it being inferential, just because you have to understand the concept of rape and the concept of wrongness and so on. Like, all of our beliefs are shaped by concepts. You have to, one is a concept, plus is a concept, equals is a concept, two is a concept. But it's not that we infer on the basis of the concept. It's that the concepts shape our thinking and perception. And once we have these concepts that are like filters in our mind, then we can see some things and we can immediately see them as true. So, you know, I wasn't born with the concept of a flask, but I'm telling you that it's a non-inferential knowledge that there's a flask in front of me. But so I have perceptual abilities, and then concepts arrive through my experience. And then once I have these concepts that filter my perception, I don't just see raw data anymore. These concepts are actually filtering my perception. The same thing with moral cases, just as mathematical cases. I acquire the concept of one and plus and so on. Look, if you want to use the term instinct, it wouldn't really matter. I would prefer to use the term immediate. There's something immediate about these beliefs. But, you know, when you think about it cognitively speaking, 1 + 1 = 2, you know, that proposition and us knowing it, cognitively speaking, that's processed, you know, through our rational faculties. And so it's a belief based on reason. And it comes to us immediately. So there isn't this faculty called instinct. We have cognitive faculties, reason, perception, memory, and so on. And there might be some instinctive element within these faculties, but it's not as if instinct is a faculty that exists independently of these.
Perhaps instinct is not a faculty, but instinct is something that we, by virtue of being human beings, have part of our physiological and psychological makeup. So in the sense, it is like fitra. And fitra allows us just instinctively to understand and grasp certain truths.
Yeah, you could say that, but you needn't put it in that language, because it's part of our fitra, our makeup as human beings, that we have reason, memory, sense perception, and so on. That's actually part of our makeup. So that when I reflect upon the proposition that 1 + 1 = 2, I am using reason in assessing that. And that's part of my makeup. And reason has been endowed with an ability to instinctively get knowledge with respect to certain things. So it's the faculty that's been endowed with the ability to instinctually, or rather immediately, grasp the truth of some proposition, I would say.
So what is the implication of this thought for classical foundationalism? Because if this is the kind of creature that I am, that I have access to certain truths, or I know certain truths just by being the kind of creature that I am, it could just be that I have my mental makeup allows me to access certain truths. I mean, I don't have to have a concept of what truths are foundational and what are inferential. I mean, I just know them, just as like I have a faculty of language. So let me connect it to something, the theory of generative grammar or generative linguistics. We have, by virtue of the kind of human beings we have and the evolutionary history that we have and the biological sort of substructure that we have, we speak language, but we can't not speak language. Even a little bit of stimulus will allow us to create infinite number of permutations and combinations of linguistic sentences.
Yeah.
In the same way, I could generate beliefs. What would you say to that sort of a thought?
So this there's something that you said. Let me just address it to begin with. Like you said that, like, maybe I don't need the notion of inferential or foundational or non-inferential, and I can just know stuff. Like, I mean, you personally don't need these notions. Like, for you to have immediate non-inferential knowledge, you don't need to have a conception of non-inferential knowledge. We are, as philosophers, taking a step back and reflecting and coming up with ways to think about how this knowledge is acquired, and there's types of knowledge that we have. But a person themselves obviously doesn't have to have that recognition.
Can I come back here? So
yeah.
even as philosophers, we can sort of dissolve the dichotomy between foundationalism and non-foundationalism if we have an understanding of human nature as being endowed with some of these qualities, whether you have an evolutionary view or a divinely created view or
Yeah. Okay. No.
That because we are the kind of creatures that we have.
Okay. Yes, but that I like that, but that wouldn't do away with the dichotomy of foundationalism in any way, shape, or form. It actually just basically shape our understanding of foundationalism. And actually, in the next session, I'm going to be going into what I'm calling fitra foundationalism, and I have a chapter on this. So, remember, foundationalism is just the view that some beliefs can be known non-inferentially. So nothing that you said there does away with that thesis. It doesn't deny foundationalism, right? So it can't get away from that. But what you would be saying, and what I think is actually true, is that what makes a belief foundational and non-foundational actually just depends on our nature as human beings. So we have a capacity to reason, right? And we said that 1 + 1 = 2, and that can be known immediately or non-inferentially. But I can't know what the weather is going to be like on Thursday next week just by thinking about it, right? Reason, given my fitra, my nature, doesn't have that capacity. So for beliefs like that, I need to base it on inference. So actually what beliefs are inferential and non-inferential depends on the makeup and capacities of our faculties given our nature as human beings. So yeah, but you wouldn't be doing away with the foundationalism at all there. I mean, there's no way you're getting around it. The moment, Danish, you accept there is non-inferential knowledge, end of story, because that is the thesis of foundationalism.
Okay, excellent. I have a couple of other questions about. I'll come back to you on this, but another time, I guess. So I have a couple of other questions. One is that you said that all mutakallimun are occasionalists, and this might be something which is alien to some of our listeners. So could you explain what that means?
Yeah, I did slip that in there as just something to think about that wasn't essential to the session today at all, really. But you know, for your listeners who were familiar with it, I mentioned it. But you know, for those who are not, basically, theologians and sometimes philosophers, scientists, and so on, who are interested in the relationship between the world and God, they construct what's called a divine action model. So a divine action model is basically a model of understanding that relates to sort of how God interacts with the world, the universe. How does God interact with it, like on a causal level, in terms of him creating it, sustaining it. Now, one divine action model basically is that God creates the universe and sustains the universe, but he set up within it certain capacities and propensities in the world, such as, like, you know, say the relationship between fire and smoke or something like that, or the relationship between one object setting another object in motion. Like one billiard ball knocking another billiard ball and setting it in motion. Like God created the world and basically gave that one of those balls the capacity to cause the effect of knocking another ball in motion. Okay, so there's a genuine causal relationship between things in the world, and they have it in their nature. But some scholars are occasionalists, and they think that there is no inherent causal relationships between things in the world, but for any cause and effect event, it's that God is directly creating and causing the event at the time, constantly, and that's like occasionalism. Sorry, Danish, you're on mute.
Oh, thanks. So you also said that all the mutakallimun are evidentialists. And that sounds slightly surprising to me because it seems to me, just through osmosis, by listening to other religious people, that apparently the Mu'tazila were far more interested in, let's say, proving everything from the bottom up, and they were more foundationalist in that sense. So, could you clarify that? I mean, and give a couple of examples, perhaps, from the representative scholars or theologians from these.
Yeah, so if you consider that, yes, the Mu'tazila were prior to the Ash'ari and Maturidi schools, right? Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, he, is considered the founder of the Ash'ari school. But when he was younger, he was a Mu'tazili. And then he left the Mu'tazili school, and he, tried to align himself with what he understood to be Orthodox Islam. And yet, when he left the Mu'tazila school, he didn't leave it completely. Like, he still took upon the methodology or epistemology of the Mu'tazila, basically. So if you look at, like, there was one example I mentioned today, like Qadi Abdul Jabbar, he talks about the distinction between ilm daruri and ilm muktasab or nadari, right? And so you make that there is this distinction between inferential, non-inferential knowledge and this foundationalism. And then, you'll find him talking about how God is not daruri knowledge and therefore must be based on some kind of inference. And then you look at some of the early Ash'aris like Al-Baghdadi and Al-Baqillani and even Al-Ash'ari himself, and they're saying the same thing. They divide knowledge into daruri and iktisabi or nadari, and that knowledge of God is not daruri, it must be based on knowledge. And you see the same thing happening basically with An-Nasafi in that Maturidi text, and you see Al-Juwayni and Al-Ghazali, the later Ash'aris, and Fakhruddin Ar-Razi, they're all saying the same thing. So the fundamental epistemology, the epistemological framework is the same. And there's an interesting article by Abdurrahman Mahirik, and a literal quote from Mahirig, and he says that there is a consensus with respect to early and later mutakallimun on these matters. There is a consensus.
All right. So about the term ilm al-daruri, now the word zaruri in Urdu, perhaps in Farsi and also in Arabic, just means necessary. So
exactly.
Why would you translate this as non-inferential and not necessary? And is there a difference between the two?
Yeah, because it's when you put it into English vernacular and necessary, it just it doesn't seem to capture actually what that kind of knowledge really entails. It is true that a more literal translation, even of the Arabic, is necessary knowledge, and you'll find that translation. But when you actually look at what they mean, what the mutakallimun mean, they mean that the knowledge is not inferred, that it is immediate, it is necessary to the human being without requiring another or inference. So when you compare what they're saying about ilm daruri and ilm muktasab, okay, or acquired knowledge, or ilm nadari, the difference is basically a matter of inference. One of them, there's no inference. Well, the other one, there is an inference, and that's and I'm not the only one who came up with that. Distinction.
Right. So what would happen to scientific knowledge, like the kind of knowledge that people acquire in a lab or after a lot of experimentation?
Yes.
It's still acquired knowledge in some sense, right? But it's not inferential in the deductive sense. But it becomes necessary after it becomes prevalent and perforates into society.
Yes. And that's a problem that, you know, the Kalam scholars have to kind of account for because you're involving the testimonial aspect. And as I told you, Western philosophers never did that. So it was much easier. They didn't have to grapple with that question. But no, I mean, remember, inference, there are lots of different kinds of inferences, you know, and they don't have to be deductive. They can be inductive. They can also be abductive. So an inference doesn't have to be deductive to be an inference. When a scientist conducts their experiments in a lab, the observations themselves are daruri, but the extrapolation from the observations to assess the hypothesis and to theorize, now that's the inferential component. It's not deductive, and it's usually often very much abductive. Which hypothesis best explains the data? And you make that inference there. So, I mean, yeah. What's the relevance of the Islamic rationalist approach today? For example, the debates like Quran being created or uncreated. This is from Razabai. Sorry, I need to bring up the chat again. Can you read that question out, Danish? Because I can't find it.
What's the relevance of the Islamic rationalist approach today? For example, the debates like Quran being created or uncreated that seemed like a massive issue in history seem irrelevant now.
Yeah, I think I would agree that that's, you know, that discussion is kind of should be over. I mean, look, since the time of Ahmed ibn Hanbal till now, there's a consensus really amongst all Sunni Muslims as to the answer to that question, then that just doesn't seem to be much of a debate as far as I'm concerned. But the question as to how we can know God is a question that will never go away, right? The question as to how we can know God. So the Islamic rationalist approach seems to me to always be around, just insofar as the question of how we can know God is around, because they are saying that this is the way that we can know God, and they construct this epistemology. And classical foundationalism and so on, although most epistemologists are not classical foundationalists now, there are still some that are writing today, contemporary philosophers, and also contemporary philosophers of religion who are classical foundationalists. And so the actual view that the medievals were defending is still being defended in contemporary philosophy of religion, in contemporary journal articles and book chapters today. So, yeah.
All right. So on the word rationalism in modern philosophy, Western philosophy rather,
Yes.
The word rationalism usually refers to the notion of acquiring knowledge not through experience but through either contemplation or deductive reasoning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, is that the sense of Islamic rationalist, or do they have an understanding of experience as well?
Yeah, I
Or
think
can they be? Are they empiricists as well in the Islamic medieval past?
Yeah, 100%. You know, I think this rationalism empiricism thing is a very old dichotomy now. I don't even want to hear it anymore. You know, when I went to a university and did my undergraduate degree and an introduction to philosophy, you know, we came across it, you know, in that. Since then, I've been doing philosophy. Nobody ever talks about it anymore in contemporary philosophy. It's just not. It's not a thing. Like this dichotomy that it's just, you know, knowledge is based on reason, or knowledge is based on sense experience. No, like nobody is dichotomous in that way anymore. People recognize that we have different abilities and tools. There might be emphases that are, you know, stressed on, say, reason is the highest source. Like what you can know by deductive reasoning is higher than what you can know by sense experience or so on. You might get those discussions back, but even still. So no, the mutakallimun are clearly empiricists as well as rationalists in that sense, because as I said, they believe that al-hiss, you know, perception is a fundamental source of knowledge. And in fact, actually, you probably would, I would say that most of the Muslim theologians in a way are empiricists, in that really experience is really the beginning, you know.
What is their understanding of experience? Because experience for the empiricists was a very strange understanding of ideas and impressions in Hume, which sounds very strange to contemporary thinkers or readers.
It sounds strange to contemporary readers, but I mean, it would probably have sounded stranger to the medievals because, we're still, okay, that Enlightenment period and so on sort of ended, but we're still living in a tradition that's like followed on from that in some sense, in like an analytic philosophy and so on in the contemporary West. But like I said earlier, for the medievals, when they said that sense perception is a source of non-inferential knowledge, they were not simply saying that the experience or the appearance that there's a cup is known non-inferentially, but actually that there is a cup in the world is known non-inferentially. So they would be what's sometimes called maybe like, not always, but I would say for the Mutakalimun, I would say like common sense realists, or what's called naive realists, or something, that our perceptions give us a window into the actual external world. They're a window through which we actually see the world directly, or they are direct realists, with respect to perception, as far as I can tell. But
but then in a sense, this is a pushback against skepticism, right? Because so the medievalists also shared this anti-skeptical view, and it also has perhaps to do with their religious background, in that they don't want to believe that God would create them to not have adequate perceptual knowledge, so that they're always somehow
in touch with the world,
in touch with reality.
I agree with that, probably.
And we have another question by Razabhai, and he says, rationalism seems to represent a greater desire to achieve certainty. Has contemporary philosophy become less interested in certainty and therefore cares less about the rationalism empiricism dichotomy? You touched on this before, but you have more to say.
Yeah, but no, I think that's actually a very interesting question, Razabhai, because I think that if you look at the Enlightenment period, if you look at what, say, Descartes and Locke in particular are doing, is Descartes, is the paradigmatic example of a philosopher that wants to build a system that's based on certain foundations. And he sees reason as the only way in which we can do that, our reliance on reason as central. And in contemporary philosophy, there's much more modesty, I would say, with respect to what we can know. So modern or contemporary philosophers are much less likely to be Cartesian in the sense, or even Lockean in the sense, that we can acquire certainty with respect to things. And they're much more happy with saying that even knowledge itself is fallible, so that, I can know that there is something in front of me, as long as certain conditions are fulfilled. But yes, a defeater could come along and take away my knowledge. So it's not infallible, but that still doesn't mean that it's not knowledge. So when I think contemporary philosophers reflect upon the Enlightenment attempt to basically build a system on these certain foundations all the way through, and they've basically assessed it as a failure. They have rejected like classical foundationalism and become a bit more modest with respect to what knowledge is. And maybe that does shape one of the reasons why this dichotomy is sort of, fallen out of the discussions.
Thank you, Jamie, again for engaging with all these questions. And we're going to come back another time next week with another interesting as this. Thank you so much, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
All right. You can